I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, the dance historian, Dr. Daye. Some of you, I'm sure, will have been to one of her many workshops or been taught by her at our summer schools, as well as reading some of her numerous publications, her work on the masque in particular. Tonight's lecture will shine a light on the overlooked lineage of female dance teachers from 1745 to the 1870s, and as the title says, one in particular, Mrs Elizabeth Elliston, who taught dance in Bath and London. So that's all I want to say. So over to you, Anne.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Richard. So I'm delighted to welcome you all to this evening's survey of the career of a female dancing teacher. The information draws on several sources, including excellent research by others on dancing in Bath and the life of Robert Elliston, alongside genealogical evidence and contextual studies, and a bibliography will be found at the end of the talk. I also look forward, as Richard says, to your questions at the end, and I have one for you to consider. How did Mrs Elliston succeed in a man's world? Some of the answers are obvious, admittedly, but look out for aspects of her professional strategies that led to success. Now, dancing masters are generally elusive creatures, unless they publish or have a significant performance profile. They were also, in Britain, the subject of caricature, often depicted as Frenchified and effeminately affected. At least the female dancing teachers escaped this censure, but they are completely out of sight. There are no portraits found to date, apart from one, which is not, regrettably, Mrs Elliston. I first came across Mrs Elliston when hunting for cotillon publications in the British Library. Her collection, Les Variétés, contains 3 cotillons, and we used La Fête de Région for the Historical Dance Society's publication, More Dances for Jane Austen. At that time, we noticed her marriage to Robert William Elliston, the famous Regency actor and manager, whose comic and romantic performances were appreciated by Jane Austen. Then about a year ago, completely by chance, bound in with several other pieces of piano music, I found a publication by her daughters. This presented the lineage of female dancing teachers in a nutshell. Mrs Elliston received it from her accomplished and esteemed preceptress, Miss Fleming, to whom the mode of performing and teaching it had been imparted by the celebrated Madame Roland, and we feel encouraged to add that precisely the same style is observed with regard to our, in this particular and favoured minuet, at our respective academies in London and Leamington. So, who was Mrs Elliston and how did she become a dancing teacher? She was born Elizabeth Rundle in Limehouse, East London, her parents being John Rundle and Lucy Collins, who themselves maybe have originated from the West Country. Now, we think of Limehouse today as being a poor and rough area, but in the 18th century, it was a new, burgeoning extension of London, centred on the naval dockyards, and the Rundles lived in Church Row. The children were baptised in St Anne's, Limehouse, and you can see here that the church had permission to fly the white ensign, which is normally flown from navy ships, to show that mariners could register in that town. And the tower was a very significant landmark from the river. A street register for 1825 for Church Row lists a solicitor alongside a sailmaker, rope maker and boat builder. John Rundle is denoted gentleman in some of the baptismal records, so I assume he was a navy bureaucrat or civil servant. At a time when managing the British Navy, furnished land-based career to thousands. There is no indication here of any connection to the theatre or to teaching. And here, this lovely view of the Fletcher's Yard at Limehouse of the time. You've got the stretch of Limehouse along the horizon, and you might just see the tower of the St Anne's Church as a very clear landmark. Nevertheless, Elizabeth and her sisters became leading teachers in Bath. Mary Ann Rundle earning an entry in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography as an educationalist, a publisher of books, and her younger sister Dorothy becoming Elizabeth's assistant. But why and how did they move to Bath? The parents and brothers clearly remained in London. Were the girls sent to school in Bath because it was a city renowned for its excellent girls' schools, or were there family connections still in the West Country? Well, Elizabeth was said to have been assistant to Miss Fleming for 13 years when she married. This means she started at age 9. To me, this seems very unusual for a girl of genteel parentage. Of course, it may mean rather that she had lessons with Miss Fleming as a schoolgirl and then graduated to assistant, having shown promise and the desire to teach. Miss Fleming was herself unusual in being a very successful dancing mistress in a city full of successful dancing masters. And she's been quite well served by history. We can only briefly touch on her life today. As you can see, she had a grandmother and a mother of French origin, and it's her mother who was the celebrated Madame Roland. And there's an obvious logic to her path in life, in contrast to the Rundles. Furthermore, she remained a spinster, and teaching, even teaching dancing, seems to have been considered respectable for single women. And here she is, Miss Fleming, and this is the portrait of only portrait I know of a female dancing teacher of the time. And apparently this paper she has, if you can see it close to, is of a ball programme to denote her career. So, by 1796, Miss Fleming, aged 50, had become the talk of Bath for her evident attraction to a young actor, Robert William Elliston, aged 22. As well as going to all his performances, she issued invitations to him to attend parties at her residence. And according to Elliston's first biographer, George Raymond, she intended to hook him by creating the impression that they were engaged to be married. Now, despite deliberately keeping her attractive young assistant in the background, Robert soon noticed Elizabeth and asked to be introduced. A courtship developed rapidly to Miss Fleming's great consternation. Very hypocritically, she wrote to Miss Rundle's family to warn them of this unsuitable match. Her brother arrived, booted and spurred from London, and whisked Elizabeth back home. Miss Fleming had now lost both her best assistant and her chance of marriage. The Rundles and Ellistons must have decided that this was a good match, so Elizabeth returned to Bath to be married in the Abbey. All Bath was buzzing with the affair and wondering how the Dancing Academy would now proceed. The general view was that there was no room for two dancing academies of this kind in Bath. It would be best for Miss Fleming and Mrs Elliston to go into partnership. And indeed, emotions calmed down and a bond for £500 sealed the arrangement between Mr and Mrs Elliston on one part and Miss Fleming on the other, and this was announced in the London Gazette. The two women continued in the paths set by the Fleming family of teaching girls and women privately at their academy, usually also the teacher's residence, and making weekly visits to the girls' schools in Bath and the surrounding area, including that in time of her sister Mary Ann Rundle. They also ran public balls in the lower and upper rooms for their pupils to demonstrate their achievements, always followed by an adult ball. Rather than playing the violin themselves for classes, like most masters, the women employed a musician to accompany them. They also eventually expanded their enterprises. Miss Anne Fleming took on a new assistant in a Miss Mercier. Her own sister, Kitty Fleming, joined Elizabeth Elliston in a second dance academy at Chapel Row, Bath. Then they started a further enterprise in private lessons at Great Pulteney Street, also the Ellistons' home. By 1801, the Ellistons moved her academy and, the family home to Milsom Street in the heart of Bath's shopping and residential district. So, who had Elizabeth Rundell married? Robert William Elliston, at the time of their marriage, was a rising star of the Bath and provincial theatres. Although his father was a mere watchmaker and drunkard, he had constant support from his two very distinguished uncles. They were both professors in Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge, the eldest being actually master of the college. Even though Elliston had run away from the life of a clergyman mapped out by them, they continued to support him through his new career. So these respectable relatives must have persuaded the Rundells to agree to the marriage. Robert Elliston was getting some roles on the London stage too at the time of the marriage. He was a versatile actor, at his best in comedy and romantic roles, but capable of tragic ones. He could play the violin and dance, and sometimes took on the role of Harlequin. Throughout his life, he performed in theatres the length and breadth of England and Scotland, even venturing over to Ireland. So here we can see him as Mercutio, one of his young and handsome parts, and as Falstaff, which he made a great success of at the end of his career. And then in the middle here, we have him as Duke Arantza in a comedy called The Honeymoon by Tobin. This particular play was a runaway success from 1805. So much so that the music for the dance in Act 4, Scene 3 was quickly marketed as a country dance from 1806. It happens also to be a dance we can link to the Austen family, as Jane's favourite niece Fanny noted in her diary on Boxing Day 1806 that she and her brother had opened the family ball with The Honeymoon. And that's another one we've included in More Dances for Jane Austen. The Honeymoon was so popular, it was published again and again throughout the 19th century, obviously with different figures, with different publishers. Now, no doubt, the Ellistons' uncles were also content with the status of the Rundells. Although we don't know what the father did as a job, we do know something about two of the brothers. So Thomas signed his letters as of the India House, and this is the building in which he worked. He was an administrator in London to the East India Company, the trading organisation that preceded colonial rule by the British in India. And as you can see, he had some distinguished and responsible roles within that. Thomas continued to advise and assist the Ellistons in the ensuing years. Charles was also employed by the East India Company, but spent his adult life in India, dying in Madras. As you can see here, one of his sons was General Francis Hornblow, another one who has an entry in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography as an engineer with great skill in organising irrigation in India. And there was another S. Rundell, and I haven't been able to find anything out about him. So whether he was a brother or not, I don't know. Now, marriage to Robert Elliston brought advantages and problems to his wife. She bore 10 children in all, only one passing away as a baby, Mary Juliet. To combine motherhood and an ever-growing household with a demanding profession would tax us today, I think, Elliston's increasing fame as an actor brought advantages, notably from the nobility and wealthy admirers. A particular support and constant one to Elliston, with valuable connections to the royal family, which would have been George III, was Lord Harcourt. And the biographer Raymond noted that. That's what you should have seen earlier. So this is the Milsom Street Academy. This is the building today. It's now a restaurant, not a bank, and that is where it was. Quite an important building in an important street in Bath. Sorry about that, missed it. Okay, back to Lord Harcourt. So Raymond noted that the interest Lord Harcourt had taken in Elliston's professional honour and advancement, flattering as it was to the husband, was yet more deeply felt in the grateful reflections of the wife. Mrs Elliston was the fashion, the rage. The young debutantes in elegant life were proud of the instruction received under her direction. The character of the pupil was sunned by the fame of the instructor. So, her aristocratic pupils would proudly say that they had learnt their steps with Mrs Elliston. Robert took every opportunity to support his wife's profession. In her turn, she supported him, giving advice on his theatrical adventures and dancing in some of his productions with her sister and then later on with her two eldest daughters. She also choreographed dances and composed music for his productions. The disadvantage was that her husband's profession took him away from home constantly, with his ambition and energies always leading him into new ventures. Also, like successful actors today, his charisma and sociability led him to stray from the narrow path of virtue and fidelity. He inherited from his father a propensity to drink. In fact, he finally died an alcoholic. He was an inveterate gambler, and there were rumours of love affairs. It is clear that Elizabeth was well aware of his weaknesses. Her brother and friends advised her of them, and they in turn chastised Robert. Yet the marriage held together, as much through Elizabeth's character and determination as any reform on the part of Robert. No doubt they shared much love and affection, and occasionally there seems to have been some bribery going on. Elizabeth made very extravagant gifts to Elizabeth from time to time. Now, testaments to Mrs Elliston's character are unfailingly positive. So when Robert wrote to his uncle about the forthcoming marriage, he described her as having goodness of heart, sweetness of temper, intellectual capabilities. The biographer calls her cheerful but circumspect, gentle yet energetic. She showed liberality with prudence. And the obituaries are overwhelmingly positive, of course. The best of wives, the most affectionate of mothers, rare and exemplary excellence of her private character. The Bath academies of Miss Fleming and Miss Elliston flourished as the new century dawned. Mrs Elliston's balls, modelled on those of Miss Fleming, were well attended, even by such aristocrats as Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire. And this advertisement is typical. The nobility and gentry of Bath are respectfully informed that Mrs Elliston's winter ball for her pupils will be held at the upper rooms on Saturday next, December the 10th. The dancing to commence precisely at 6. Mrs Elliston requests her friends will recollect that the seats in front are reserved for the pupils and those immediately behind for their relatives. Tickets, 5 shillings each, to be had of Mrs Elliston, 39 Milsom Street, and at the upper rooms. Now, this advertisement should remind us that Mrs Elliston needed to deal with the business side of her profession, employing musicians and assistants, booking classes and travel to more distant schools, accounting for the fees, a lot of correspondence. Then for the balls, organising the venue, the band, the refreshments, the outgoings and the income, while planning the dresses and turnout of her students and marshalling them on the day, and not least overseeing the artistic side of the whole. Okay, at about this time, there was a little adventure. So the following anecdote by Raymond is an indication of the fame of Miss Fleming and Mrs Elliston at that time. The story reflects the values of the day, and I warn you, it may give offence. Earlier in the autumn of 1803, 3 ladies travelled from Ireland to Bath to study dancing, having a series of private lessons booked with Mrs Elliston. Unfortunately, a few days before, young William Elliston, aged 5, had attempted to slide down the banisters from the top floor, had fallen off and knocked himself unconscious. Mrs Elliston was preoccupied with nursing him back to health. Robert was at home, so imagining that 3 pretty young women were on their way, he decided to teach them himself. However, the group was led by a tall, skinny, elderly woman, had 2 younger ones, probably her daughters, all from Knockmeal Down in Tipperary. They were escorted to Milsom Street by their black footman. The Ellistons' French harpsichordist sat down to play, described as the little émigré, and playing like a spinning jenny, in other words, noisy and fast, and chattering away all the time. Elliston started to teach the older woman a cotillon, then a minuet, while the other 2 waited their turn, then falling into paroxysms of laughter at the sight. All 3 became enamoured of charismatic Robert, dancing with increasing abandon, losing all track of time, until a servant hinted that it was dinner time by offering some refreshment. Cruikshank has imagined the scene in the Ellistons' great Pulteney Street house, with the black footman in the doorway watching with astonishment at the antics of his mistress. Now, I can try to let you hear one of Mrs Elliston's cotillon tunes while we look at this, so let's see how we go. If I can do that. Oh no, don't do that. I need to do just that. Apart from the comedy of the incident and the story, it shows us that the reputation of Mrs Elliston went beyond Bath, that she employed a French harpsichordist, owned a harpsichord, and confirms what I've often wondered about, is that a private lesson, the teacher endeavoured to teach even the set dances to a single pupil. Now, 1804, the next year, saw a new stage in the life of the Ellistons. Robert was invited to join the Drury Lane Company. Sorry, I just moved something out of the way. Making his debut in September 1804. So this is the top of the tree in London Theatre. The family must have debated for some time whether to move from Bath to London. And it is worth noting that there is a gap in the births of children between Charles, the last to be born in Bath in 1804, and Albinia, who was the first to be born in London in 1808. Now, at this time, Miss Fleming retired in 1805, and Mrs Elliston reduced her teaching in the girls' schools, keeping just the academy in Milsom Street. A permanent move to London was triggered in 1807, when Robert's uncle died, leaving him a substantial sum of money in his will. This good fortune reached the ears of Jane Austen. Via her aunt in Bath, and Jane then passed on the news to Cassandra in a letter of the 20th of February 1807. Elliston, she tells us, has just succeeded to a considerable fortune on the death of an uncle. I would not have it enough to take him from the stage. She should quit her business and live with him in London. This news had travelled fast, as Dr. Elliston had only died 9 days earlier. House hunting in London commenced, with the support of her brother Thomas and a friend, Mr. Phipps. It is clear that the house would need to be suitable for a dancing academy. Mrs. Elliston had no intention of quitting her business to become a wife alone. They were interested in one in Stratford Place, a new street already occupied by members of the aristocracy, and this was a bit of new build extending north from Oxford Street. And those of you who might know that area, the entrance from Stratford Place into Oxford Street is opposite Bond Street tube station. It's still there, as you can see. It's a modern picture. Rundle and Phipps, though, advise that they look at Bedford Place, as, to quote their letter, families of rank and title, the very people who might become patrons of yourself and wife, might look coldly, disdainfully on you as next-door neighbours. As an actor and gentleman, you are entitled to respect, but as an aristocrat or man of fashion, you would be laughed at. They pointed out that neither Garrick nor Kemble, the other famous actors of the day, sought to live at such a posh address. And finally they added, but for God's sake, do not let any duke overhear the fiddle of a dancing school, or your neighbour the Countess observe the actor stepping into a hackney coach. Well, the Ellistons ignored this advice and set up home and the dancing academy at 9 Stratford Place. The spacious rooms, a series of which could be opened up for a ball, were ideal. And here's an estate agent's view of inside. Most of these are offices now, but you can see how lovely they are. And in fact, in the 1920s, you might be interested to know that Grace Cohn started her dancing school at 20 Stratford Place, and then later with Olive Ripman joined to become the Arts Educational Schools, which are today leading performing arts schools. Not there, of course, now. Now, Mrs. Elliston managed schools in Bath and London with the assistance of a Miss Perry for some years, until by 1812 she handed over the Bath enterprise to her sister Dorothy. They retained their Milsom Street house for some time. Her mother, Mrs. Lucy Rundle, died there in 1811. Her London balls were as much a draw as those in Bath. She even had the patronage of Charles Wesley, the son of the Reverend Charles Wesley, the founder of Methodism. What could be more respectable? Meanwhile, Robert was putting his valuable inheritance to good use by moving into the world of theatre management alongside his acting. A man of enormous energy, he opened theatres and other ventures all over Britain, including, for our story, in the newly fashionable Spa at Leamington. He even ran Drury Lane Theatre itself from 1819 to 1826. Although less famous now than his contemporaries, Garrick, Kean and Kemble, Elliston was admired in his day and acted up to 2 weeks before his death. He is also remembered for challenging the arcane and restrictive monopoly laws, particularly through his work in the provincial theatres. We now turn to Mrs. Elliston, publisher, composer, choreographer. The sole extant work, Les Variétés, is a very different product from the usual run of collections of country dances, cotillons and minuets of the publishers, and even from those issued by dancing masters. First of all, it is larger than the usual oblong quarto format. It's actually a full folio size, 16 pages, cost 5 shillings, published by Preston in London. It doesn't have a date, which is quite common for these things, but we can estimate that it is no earlier, at least, than 1812. It's dedicated to her sister at Milsom Street, Bath, and the dedication is signed E. Elliston, Stratford Place, London. It mentions 2 former books that she has produced. This is her third, which were called Trafalgar and the Graces. They don't seem to exist anymore. Nobody yet has, well, some of us have not found them. And one of her, in her dedication, she mentions the success of my other works, which has led her to this one. And it is very clear, she states that the music is composed and set for pianoforte by Mrs Elliston. And she makes the humble point that the point I have arrived at required no great invention or considerable talent. I have endeavoured to compose melodies grateful to the ear and to give them that accent which is the soul of dancing. Right, the contents. She issues 6 country dances with simple but inventive figures. Scrub's Delight, Mr Fell's Fancy, Stratford Place, Widow Jones, Dr Johnson's Fancy, and the Gallop in a 9/8 metre. No doubt those names all mean something, and we can recognise the reference to Stratford Place. There's a tune for the minuet, no figures. There's one called The Sailor's Joy, a hornpipe, which is in 2/4 and is a dotted rhythm with the traditional or the conventional pom-pom-poms at bar 16 of each of the figures, of the strains. There's a slow waltz with no figures, and 3 cotillons, La Fête de Région, La Victoire, Isla de Léon. There's a fancy dance in 6/8, which is quite long, with no figures to it, 4 times 16 bars, plus 8 bars da capo. And then the variation reel, which she says may be danced as a common reel. I suggest we have here an insight into Mrs Elliston's teaching programme as the Regency began in 1811 and when dancing was in transition from the Georgian repertoire to the Victorian, exemplified most particularly by offering music for both a minuet and a waltz. Her daughters record that she would open her balls dancing a minuet in full court dress. The waltz was only just taking off in England in 1812. She provides easy country dance figures for which the stepping was fairly limited. Then cotillons, which of course are soon to be replaced by the quadrille. Cotillons demand the learning of French steps. La Victoire requires frequent rigodon and balancé, as does Isla de Léon. And also that dance mentions contretemps and pirouette. The titles are up to date. La Fête de Région is the prince's first birthday as regent, which was in 1811. And the others are 2 victories in the Peninsular War. We are going to add La Victoire to our, how am I doing? Sorry. I'm going to play you a little bit of La Victoire because we've started to record it. And you can hear one of her little tunes. The popularity of reels is served by the variation reel, which would have required the teaching of Scotch steps. And the tune for a fancy dance would be intended for either a solo or a group choreography by her pupils at the demonstration balls. And this term fancy dance was now taking over from the Georgian one of figure dance for the group choreographies arranged by dancing masters for their pupils. And finally, the hornpipe. Indeed, I think for a solo dance, although she has added some country dance figures, but there's more music than is needed for the country dance. Called Sailor's Joy, I would suggest it's to be danced by a boy, and if so, it would be perhaps indicating that Mrs Elliston also taught boys. This is also typical in that, topical rather, in that it was the actor Thomas Potter Cook here, who was just making the sailor's hornpipe a feature of stage performances that became that popular phenomenon which we are still familiar with. And he would work for Elliston as well in 1809, from 1809. So Thomas Potter Cook is somebody to remember. Now, the pedagogic and choreographic talents of Elizabeth Elliston and her sisters were passed on to at least two of her daughters. As we can see from a brief look at their lives, they made thoroughly respectable marriages, maintained busy dancing schools at high-class addresses. The eldest became Mrs Eliza Torr, and she married Nicholas Torr, who's certainly a gentleman. His profession was private classical tutor. He had come from Beverley in Yorkshire and had got his degree from New College, Oxford, and later in life became a Freemason. So very much part of the respectable middle class of Leamington. Their lives allow us to look at some of the censuses. So in 1851 census, the household, part of the household anyway, this is not the whole household, lists Mrs Torr and two daughters and a sister-in-law, all of them dancing teachers. So we have 4 teachers of dancing at that address, and a housekeeper and servant, in case we were wondering how these women managed with running the house. She had children too, other children too. Leamington, we've mentioned before, it's an up-and-coming new spa town. And the home of the Torrs was only a few streets away from the pump and assembly rooms. I think this is just such a charming picture. And then the other daughter was married a Mr Wilson, fortunately a Marmaduke Wilson, so he can be traced a bit more easily amongst all the myriad Wilsons of the day. And they had their home in 22 Connaught Square, London. Now this is another prestigious development, not far from Marble Arch. Today there are names you might recognise, such as Tony Blair and his family have got a property there, Claudia Winkleman. And the usefulness of these lovely buildings for dancing schools was also discovered by Taglioni. So there's little inset here, you can just see a blue plaque for Marie Taglioni, ran her dancing school there when she retired from the stage. Now, Marmaduke Wilson was a professor of music and was born in Piccadilly, Westminster. Again, the 1851 household lists a similar establishment. Mrs Wilson herself, 2 of the grown-up daughters, and 1 sister of Mr Wilson, all of them designated teachers of dancing. And then they have a nursemaid, a housemaid, and a cook. So, Elizabeth Elliston died in 1821 at the age of 47. She had been wife, mother, dancing teacher, dancer, businesswoman, capable choreographer and musician. Her story presents, I think, a little known strand of dance teaching. The few female dancing teachers we know of from the 18th century were retired stage dancers with no husband to maintain them. Miss Fleming's career originates in that world, although she herself didn't perform on the stage. I find it unusual that a dancing teacher emerges from a solid middle-class background and her successors continue in a solidly genteel manner. We can also trace in this story the passing on of knowledge and methods from one generation of dancing teachers to another. So I leave you with a little collage evoking the court minuet, which has been one of the threads through this story. Such an important part of the curriculum of these ladies, none of whom would have attended a court levee, but whose pupils would do so. Then on the left is a lady in court dress from around 1807, such as Mrs Elliston might have worn to open her balls. And on the right, a charming pupil of the very next generation, ready to dance a minuet painted by Millet. And of course, as I said, here is the bibliography. So that is it. Thank you. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Anne, for such a fascinating and eye-opening lecture. I'm sure Mrs Elliston herself would feel that you'd done justice to her, bringing her to the attention of people throughout the world this evening. So Annette has been looking through the questions. Annette, if you'd like to put what you've got to Anne, please.
Yeah, I've got my voice. Oh, there I am. I've got my voice. I just need rid of Andy's screen somehow. Right, okay, I'll fire away. The first question we've got is, how many lessons would the typical one gentleman or lady have to become, I guess, you know, accomplished?
No idea, really. The point is that usually you would be taught from childhood. So I think the norm was weekly lessons through childhood, perhaps from about age 6. And I don't think I can answer any more definitely than that. Though sometimes there's evidence of a master, not a woman, I don't think, but a master being resident in an aristocratic house for a period of time and therefore giving an intensive course. But I haven't got that kind of information, no.
Okay, thank you. And then we have a question from Geraldine Buchanan. The 2 cotillions that are named in connection with the Peninsular War, La Victoire and Île de Léon, are you able to say a little more about which aspects of that war the titles might have come from?
Yes, they both deal with battles in a similar area. Isla de Léon is in Spain. I've forgotten the details of that, but they were British victories. And they were from leadership of Wellesley, who later became the Duke of Wellington. And the Prince Regent offered a medal for the victories, which was, you know, advertised in the London Gazette and things, which is what the La Victoire refers to, I think. So you need to look into the Peninsular War, which is when the English were helping the Spanish and Portuguese to get Napoleon out of that area. I hope that's sufficient.
Okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned about the little boy dancing the hornpipe. And
Yeah.
we have a question, were the ladies teaching girls exclusively or were there mixed classes? So I guess was the little boy taught on his own, or do you think?
Well, again, you know, this is only circling round areas that are relatively unresearched. Yes, lady dancing, well, the people we're talking about taught girls, probably, and obviously some women. The men dancing teachers taught both. So men always taught both girls and boys. So you know, this is just the only little sign I have that maybe she taught some boys.
Okay.
And I would expect them to be in separate classes, yes, because the tendency was for women to be taught separately from men in this kind of field. The masters advertised, if we're for public dancing classes, they would advertise men attend on a Wednesday evening and women on a Thursday morning. There was never mixed, which is why that little scene is so interesting. And the tale that goes with it, because the masters must have been used to teaching men how to dance country dances and cotillons and such like, and minuets, without women in the room. So it's a different, you know, that because the decorum was to keep them apart, men and women apart.
I guess this
Oops.
question is linked in a way. Someone asks, would dance lessons include other skills such as etiquette and manners?
Oh, yes.
And
Yes.
I guess if you were teaching them separately, that you teach them what each gender needed to know.
Yes, no, that's a given, I think.
So,
You know, how to enter a room, how to bow, curtsy, what to do in certain situations. That was the dancing teacher's responsibility.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay, you'll like this question. When will your new music recording be available to buy?
It'll certainly be out by the end of the year. It's it's a very big collection of dances and 2 CDs of music. So if you're interested, keep your eye on the Historical Dance Society publications page. And obviously all members will get the information as soon as it's ready. It's taken a bit longer because the lockdown's given leisure to actually investigate things a bit more. So it's going to be a very rich collection, I hope. And I hope people find it interesting. Yeah.
We have a question about North America. Did you find any evidence of female dancing mistresses in North America?
Well, I can't claim to have done much work in that field. I have actually, through looking at the changes from cotillon to quadrille, which is one of the things we will sort of explore in the new book, got some information from America. I think all the sources that I've used are for men. But there has been a wonderful researcher. She's passed away now, but Kate Van Winkle Keller is the person to look out for sources and information on women. She's done a very, I've got her book here. She's done quite a big book about dancing in America. So Kate Van Winkle Keller, Kelleller, is the person to start with for that.
Thank you. Someone mentions the Coronation March, which was composed by a Miss Elliston, and she's wondering whether it was one of her daughters.
Oh, that's interesting. So
Yeah.
the Coronation March by a Miss Elliston.
Yes, in roughly 1820. This is Susan who's asking the question. I don't know who's.
Oh, right. Yeah, well.
It'd be worth investigating.
Yes, indeed. That's very interesting.
And Libby, sorry, go on.
No, it's all right. You go.
Libby asked, did you find copies of ball programs, and were the dances all Mrs. Elliston's own choreography, or did she include other dances of the year as well? No,
I have not found ball programs.
Right.
No, there's a lot of areas around this topic that could be explored. I mean, I think one thing is newspapers and advertisements for her classes and her balls. That's not an area I've done anything with myself. So that somebody else might like to pick that up.
Look for, yes. I think you may have covered this one, but I'll read it again. What are, in your knowledge, the number of women teachers compared with men in Mrs. Elliston's period? I think she was quite exceptional, wasn't she?
I think she's exceptional, yes. I mean, I'd be happy to be contradicted. As I said at the very beginning, it's very hard to find out about dancing teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And men are very elusive unless they do something significant. And again, in this more lockdown period, I've been able to explore one little dynasty of male dancing teachers in Kent, which shows something, and a single one in London, which was extremely interesting to know a bit more, because they're often seen as this, you know, slightly unacceptable little figure. But I think they were probably the caricatures we've been sold have distorted our view of them. You need to travel. This is the thing. Mrs Elliston and the Flemings were based in big cities, largish cities. They did have to travel around. Miss Fleming, I know, travelled in a sedan chair to the schools that she taught at. But of course, that's a little bit of a problem for women. You know, the Kent masters I've looked at, they travelled quite a long way, probably out on a day on horseback. So a journey of a couple of hours to a client and back. So, you know, it's a lot we could learn, I think, still about them. And you know, anybody who's adding and pursuing this themselves, it would be really interesting to have more back from others. Yeah, anyway, yeah.
These two questions are linked in a way, and really it's again about the way of life. At what age were they allowed to dance together if they were taught separately? And if the girls were being taught dances that would normally be coupled, does that mean that one of them played the male part when they were dancing?
Well, I think we can only guess, really. So, yes, obviously there was a certain formality. The thing is that this work has arisen out of looking more closely at Jane Austen. And what you can see in her life is lots of home dancing, where you had boys and girls. So the family danced at home and the neighbours did. Then you had more organised occasions, which you could call a ball, when you had people invited in. And if that were family and friends, well, that's fine. Then you've got these public balls. So the assembly rooms and places like that, you had to be introduced. So once you were considered old enough to go to such a ball, which could be mid-teens, I think, you know, that you could carry yourself off decently, then you were introduced to people. So I think we have to backtrack and deduce that either the dancing master or the pupils, if it was more than one, would have to take the other gender role. So if it was a class, I mean, again, I'm looking at Fanny Austen, who was brought up in an upper class home. She puts these lovely little notes in her diary, just like any old young girl. She says, dance today. After the ball at Christmas that I mentioned earlier, the next day had a headache, didn't do any work. She mentions this Mr. Philpot, who's the dancing master. And so sometimes it's simply something like, Mr. Philpot came today. Well, we don't know what Mr. Philpot did. Then another occasion, she'll say, Mr. Philpot came today and we had a little country dance. And then if you look at the household, you can see that he could have made up a little set of 6 out of her younger children, because she was the eldest, just enough of the younger children, and maybe the governess. You could just about perhaps get 3 males, actual males, and 3 girls, and the dancing master would play. So yeah, it's one of the reasons that I pursued this Jane Austen thing, because there's so much information because of her fame about, and all the letters and all the family letters, that you can actually get little nuggets of this insight into how the dancing actually worked. Yeah, but that's, I mean, it's scattered. Anybody who reads a you know, a diary or a memoir and it's got dancing information in, then pass it along.
Mm. When you were talking about men and women teaching and how women were rarer than men, I did wonder whether that was because women were hidden sort of under a sort of male umbrella. And Susan mentions that North American female dancing teachers were often daughters of male dancing teachers.
Aye.
There's two examples, Miss Durang and Miss Whale.
Uh-huh.
So I guess they could have been sort of hidden in a way that, you know.
Yes, yes. I mean, there's this Miss Mercier that Miss Fleming took on at Bath, and there's a one in the bibliography. There's this Mr. Trevor Fawcett's dance and teachers of dance in 18th century Bath. He goes into all the ones that are around, and there are some female assistants who work for their fathers, sort of thing, as has been mentioned. So yeah, it's just getting that. You know, this is I mean, I may be distorting it, but you know, I found this rather an unusual whole sequence of women.
Yeah.
I think, Annette, we've time for just one more question.
Yes, well, I've come to the end of the list, so that's very well timed.
That was, yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Annette, and thank you, Anne, for those answers.
Pleasure.
That concludes Anne's lecture this evening. We hope to see many of you at the next webinar, which is next Wednesday, the 5th of August at 7 p.m. British Summer Time. Our speaker is going to be Ilona Azola, the Chief Officer for Education and Research at the Bauska Castle Museum in Latvia. Her intriguing subject is the impact of astrology and astronomy on the stories told through Renaissance dance. And I must say that Newton was quite big into that kind of thing at a later time. So thank you all for coming, and goodbye.